Let's talk about reverence, because reverence is a powerful thing. It's not merely respect, it's awe. Reverence is what you feel when you're confronted by something greater than yourself, something that transcends the limits of your understanding, something sacred. Now, human beings are wired for this. Psychologically, we're predisposed to assign reverence where we perceive depth, authority, or the divine, and rightly so. But here's the danger. Reverence that isn't grounded in truth doesn't remain neutral. It begins to drift. It starts out as devotion, but over time it can metastasize into idolatry. When God reveals himself, he doesn't ask for blind sentiment. He demands truth, discernment, hierarchy, and clarity. There's a proper order to things. Reverence is meant to elevate our moral attention toward that which is truly sacred, that which deserves to be at the top of our internal hierarchy, namely Christ, the Logos, the one in whom truth, structure, responsibility, and sacrifice converge. But the human psyche, when untethered from truth, will often take what is good and inflate it beyond measure. This is especially true in religion. You start with something holy, like Mary, the mother of Jesus, a symbol of humility, obedience, and profound courage. And if you're not careful, over time that symbol can swell to the point where it overshadows the very truth it was meant to point toward. And then the symbol becomes a substitute, and then a rival, and eventually an idol. Now, this isn't a condemnation of Mary, not at all. She deserves honor. She was chosen for a reason, and she accepted her role with remarkable grace, but she was human. She was not divine. And yet, in certain circles of the church, most visibly in statements recently made by the Pope, there's been a shift, a suggestion, subtle or overt, that Mary occupies a redemptive role alongside Christ, a co-mediatrix, a psychologically has profound consequences. Let's be clear, you cannot have two redeemers. That fractures the very structure of salvation. It distorts the hierarchy of truth. It brings confusion into the moral order. And in psychological terms, that's catastrophic, because your psyche, your very identity, is built on the foundation of singular orientation toward what is ultimate. If that ultimate becomes pluralized or sentimentalized, you no longer know where to aim. You lose moral direction. You lose clarity. And what replaces it is not reverence, but delusion, masquerading as devotion. And this isn't just abstract theology. This plays out in real lives. People begin to pray to Mary not as a symbol of surrender, but as a dispenser of favors, a cosmic mother figure who will soften divine judgment that bypasses the difficult, soul-transforming relationship with Christ. The one who calls you to die to yourself, pick up your cross, and follow him. Instead, it appeals to the part of you that wants comfort without confrontation. It soothes rather than sanctifies. But here's the paradox. The comfort that comes from idolatry is ultimately hollow. It gives you a temporary sense of spiritual warmth, but it doesn't change you. It doesn't demand anything of you. And that's precisely why it's so dangerous. Because real transformation, spiritual, psychological, moral, requires confrontation with the truth, with the Logos, with Christ. When we elevate Mary beyond her rightful place, we don't just commit theological error, we weaken the soul. We train people to look sideways when they should be looking up. We confuse the symbol with the source. And once that confusion sets in, the entire internal hierarchy begins to collapse. The conscience becomes foggy. The will becomes weak. And what was meant to be reverence ends up serving rebellion. Rebellion against the structure of truth, against the moral authority of Christ, against the very order that makes spiritual growth possible. And think for a moment, who benefits from this confusion? Certainly not the believer. Certainly not the soul that's genuinely seeking transformation. No, the one who benefits from this is the one who wants to keep people docile, submissive, emotionally dependent. This is how religious narcissism functions. It hijacks reverence and redirects it toward a symbol it can control. It creates emotional loyalty without moral clarity. And that's not holiness, it's manipulation. If the church truly wants to serve its people, it must return to the proper ordering of reverence. Honor Mary, yes, but worship Christ. Draw inspiration from her obedience, but pattern your life around his sacrifice. Revere her example, but follow his commands. Because the moment you confuse those roles, you begin to build your spiritual house on a foundation that cannot bear the weight of your suffering. So we need to ask the uncomfortable question. Has the Pope, perhaps even unknowingly, crossed a line? Has he, in elevating Mary, begun to erode the very foundation of Christian faith and psychological coherence? That's not a question to answer with sentiment. It's a question to answer with courage, discernment, and an unwavering commitment to truth. And for you personally, for every individual listening, this is the time to take inventory. Where have you misplaced your reverence? What symbols have you elevated beyond their rightful place? Are you worshiping what comforts you or what calls you higher? Because at the end of the day, your soul cannot afford confusion, and neither can the church. You must reorient your reverence, because what you worship will define what you become. It's important that we recognize just how easily religious language can be weaponized, and not in the obvious way we often think. I'm not talking about overt tyranny or some totalitarian crusade. I'm talking about something far more insidious. A kind of spiritual manipulation that occurs when reverence is repackaged into emotional coercion. One of the most effective ways that this happens, particularly in religious hierarchies, is through the misapplication of the symbolic feminine, through the psychological inflation of a maternal figure into a divine one. And if we're honest, the elevation of Mary to a redemptive status isn't just a theological drift, it's a psychological power play. Religious narcissism thrives on confusion. It doesn't operate in clarity because clarity invites confrontation with truth, because proof is suffering, and crime may be justified by power so that proof can lead to truth. What it wants is emotional fusion, emotional dependence. It wants followers, not thinkers, subjects, not disciples. So how do you achieve that within a structure that claims to represent divine order? You start by gently, almost imperceptibly, shifting attention away from the hard, demanding logos, Christ himself, and onto something softer, something maternal, something that feels safe. That's the key word here, feels. Something that warns against the death of the Son. This life sucks, but you shall be safe tomorrow. And this is why Mary as a symbol becomes so potent. Because in her is the image of the nurturing mother, the gracious intercessor, the one who understands your pain. There's a psychological appeal here that's undeniable, especially in a generation marked by abandonment, trauma, and fatherlessness. People want comfort. They want assurance. And when the church presents Mary as the one who can provide that, who can bend the Father's will, who mediates when Christ is too severe, well, then people start to shift their allegiance without even realizing it. Their prayers become more about Mary's intercession than Christ's lordship. Their emotional dependence grows. Their psychological orientation moves away from order and sacrifice and towards sentimentality and indulgence. But here's the hard truth. The moment you replace the transcendent masculine, Christ, the Logos, with a maternal surrogate, you open the door to narcissistic exploitation. Why? Because the symbolic mother, when overemphasized, can become a tool for control. She doesn't ask for truth, she asks for loyalty. She doesn't demand transformation, she offers validation. And when that version of Mary is presented as co-redeemer, you're no longer participating in Christianity. You're participating in a disguised form of emotional dependency, cloaked in religious language. Look closely at the dynamic. This isn't about Mary, the historical person. This is about how institutional structures exploit the symbol of Mary to displace the rightful authority of Christ. And that's exactly what narcissistic systems do. They take what is good, beautiful, even holy, and twist it into a psychological tool of compliance. Narcissism always masks itself as benevolence. Always. The spiritual abuser doesn't come to you as a tyrant. He comes as your intercessor, your protector, your mother. This tactic is remarkably effective because it bypasses the rational faculties. It speaks directly to the emotional brain, the wounded child inside each of us who longs for safety. And when the church becomes a surrogate mother rather than a guide toward the Father, it is no longer fulfilling its sacred function. It is infantilizing the faithful. It is grooming them for compliance. And worse, it's doing so in the name of holiness. This is the same psychological mechanism we see in abusive relationships. The narcissist offers affection, praise, and validation, not because they love you, but because they need you to need them. That need becomes the hook. The same principle applies here. Elevate Mary just enough to overshadow Christ, just enough to reroute your sense of spiritual safety, and then position the institution as the gatekeeper of that access. That's not devotion, that's manipulation. And I want you to really think about the implications of this, because this kind of spiritual inversion doesn't just alter your theology, it alters your identity. You begin to orient your conscience around appeasement rather than conviction, around comfort rather than responsibility, around external mediation rather than internal transformation. You trade the cross for the cradle. You cease to grow. And what does that produce? It produces a generation of believers who remain emotionally dependent, morally fragile, and spiritually disoriented. People who are loyal to the church, but not to Christ. People who speak of Mary with more passion than they speak of the truth. People who are afraid to confront spiritual abuse because they've been taught that questioning anything maternal is blasphemous. This isn't reverence. This is regression. And it's time we call it what it is, a form of spiritual narcissism wrapped in the language of compassion. The challenge then is to reclaim clarity, to resist the temptation to confuse the comfort of the maternal with the sovereignty of the divine. Mary should point you to Christ, not replace him. She should remind you of obedience, not become the object of your spiritual dependence. Reverence for her is only healthy when it deepens your allegiance to him. So when the Pope, or anyone else, begins to speak of Mary in redemptive terms, you must ask, is this drawing me closer to the truth or into an emotional system I'm being groomed to depend on? Because the psychological cost of misplaced reverence is nothing less than spiritual slavery. Let's talk about what happens when authority detaches itself from truth, when the symbolic spine of a religious institution begins to bend, not out of humility, but out of fear, pride, or the desperate desire to preserve its own image. This is where reverence begins to metastasize into something far more dangerous, into rebellion, not rebellion against man, but against God. Because the most subtle form of rebellion doesn't show up as outright defiant. It shows up cloaked in tradition, hidden in ritual, and spoken in words that sound holy but deny the very structure of reality they claim to uphold. What we're witnessing, particularly in some of the decisions and declarations emerging from the highest levels of religious authority, isn't just doctrinal slippage. It's the re-engineering of responsibility. It's a refusal to carry the weight of sacred order. And once you begin to blur the lines between tradition and innovation, between fidelity and appeasement, you're no longer serving the truth, you're serving the system. That's a critical distinction. Because once a religious system begins to serve itself rather than the transcendent truth it was meant to steward, it becomes not a house of worship, but a machine of compliance. We have to be clear about this. Authority, when rightly aligned, exists to preserve order, not invent meaning. It doesn't have the liberty to redefine reality in order to accommodate popular sentiment. And yet that's precisely what we see happening when the sacred is reinterpreted not through the lens of divine revelation, but through the lens of emotional comfort or political expedience. This is not just a failure of doctrine. It is a psychological collapse of integrity. And the implications are massive. Because when those who represent divine authority no longer speak with the weight of truth, but with the fluidity of cultural trends, they sever the moral contract with the people they lead. And those people, many of whom are already fractured, disoriented, and looking for something solid to hold on to, are left in a state of moral and spiritual vertigo. They don't know where they stand because the very ground beneath them has been moved. This is how a generation becomes ripe for spiritual abuse, when trust in divine order is violated under the pretense of reverence, when language is hijacked not to clarify the truth, but to obscure it. And let's be clear, this isn't a matter of interpretation. This is about psychological alignment. The individual begins to orient not around reality, but around the institution's performance of reality. That's not faith, that's delusion. And the tragedy here is that people don't notice it's happening because it doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like reverence. It feels like compassion. It feels like inclusion. But what is actually occurring is the dislocation of the logos, the word, the structure, the meaning that gives all things coherence. And when that logos is displaced, chaos inevitably follows. The psychological structure of the human being is wired to respond to truth. We are made to align ourselves with what is real, not just what is comforting. But when those in positions of religious power distort that reality by elevating figures, symbols, or rituals above their ordained purpose, they create a fragmentation in the soul of the believer. You can see it in their eyes, the confusion, the doublethink, the inability to reconcile what they're being told with what they know deep down to be true. And at that point, the person faces a profound crisis. Either conform to the illusion and betray your conscience, or confront the illusion and risk being cast out. That's not just a theological dilemma. That's a psychological trauma. It's a form of betrayal, spiritual betrayal. And that's why this conversation matters. Because once that betrayal sets in, the individual is either crushed under the weight of religious manipulation or they wake up. They begin to see that the authority they once trusted has been compromised. And that realization is painful, but it is also the beginning of freedom. There's a great danger in mistaking institutional consistency for spiritual integrity. Just because a tradition has persisted doesn't mean it's still aligned with the truth. History is littered with examples of powerful institutions that became corrupt precisely because they refused to be corrected by the truth. They protected their image, their authority, their influence, but not the people, not the truth. And eventually that always leads to collapse, because no system, no matter how ancient or revered, can survive long when it rebels against the structure of reality itself. The human soul longs for something immovable, something real. And when that longing is hijacked by spiritual leaders who no longer speak from truth but from convenience, we must call it what it is: rebellion masked as reverence. So here's the question every person of faith must ask right now: am I worshiping what is real or what is safe? Because if we continue to prioritize comfort over clarity, we will not only lose our spiritual heritage, we will lose ourselves. If the pursuit of truth makes you an outcast, then be cast out. Better to be exiled in truth than exalted in illusion. Let's take a deeper look at the psychological consequences of false elevation. Specifically, what happens when we exalt a symbol beyond its intended place in the moral hierarchy? And I want you to pay very close attention to this, because this is not simply a matter of theological nitpicking. It's a matter of what happens when the structure of reality, the very architecture of meaning, becomes inverted. When you elevate anything, even something good, even something pure, above its rightful position, you invite distortion, you warp the moral fabric, and worse, you create a spiritual double bind. You leave people trapped between revering what feels sacred and questioning what feels wrong. And that tension doesn't just live in the intellect. It buries itself deep in the psyche. Now let's consider Mary, the mother of Jesus, an archetype of obedience, humility, and maternal virtue. A figure revered for her submission to the will of God, not her dominance over it. But what happens when that symbol, deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian imagination, becomes elevated not merely as a servant of the divine, but as a co-redemptrix, a co-mediator? That's not just a theological misstep. It's a metaphysical restructuring of the cosmos. Because now, instead of Christ being the sole mediator between God and man, something affirmed clearly and repeatedly in Scripture, you have a competing figure. And whether people admit it or not, this introduces a second center of gravity into the soul. And the soul cannot serve two masters, not psychologically and not spiritually. It's chaos disguised as comfort. And the people caught in the middle, they begin to feel it. They feel it when their prayers to God become diluted by fear that bypassing Mary might offend her. They feel it when their devotion becomes divided, their allegiance torn between the Christ who bled and the symbol who nurtured. And again, let's be clear. Mary's role was sacred, but it was not sovereign. She was the vessel, not the voice of God. The frame, not the picture. And this is where the psychological fracture happens. Because if you exalt the frame above the picture, the entire meaning of the image is lost. You don't just obscure truth, you invert it. And when the mind begins to associate comfort and closeness with the symbol rather than the source, it creates an idolatrous attachment. It looks like piety, but it's actually dependency. Psychological dependency masquerading as spiritual depth. This isn't about dismissing Mary, it's about keeping her within the moral order of Scripture. When reverence becomes rebellion, it always does so subtly, slowly, deceptively. It often begins with emotion, love, admiration, awe, and then it mutates into a demand for mediation, intercession, and power. And eventually the line between honoring and worshiping is not just crossed, it's erased. And when that line disappears, what emerges is a counterfeit structure, a new metaphysical map that doesn't lead to truth but to confusion. And confusion is the enemy of peace. When people are confused about who holds authority in their spiritual life, when the distinction between the Savior and the symbol becomes blurred, they lose clarity, not just in doctrine, but in identity. They begin to pray with fear instead of faith. They look up to heaven with divided loyalty. They build altars in their hearts to comfort rather than truth. And truth cannot live in a divided temple. This is not an abstraction. This plays out in the lives of real people. People raised in systems where questioning the elevation of Mary is seen as rebellion, ironically, while the actual rebellion against God's design is ignored or celebrated. People who are spiritually exhausted because they are constantly trying to navigate a spiritual system with two centers of power, and the human mind, especially the vulnerable, trauma-exposed mind, cannot tolerate that ambiguity for long. It will either break or submit. And submission, in this case, is not peace. It is psychological slavery. And what's even more tragic is that those enslaved often believe they are free. They mistake the calm of ritual for the peace of truth. They confuse repetition with revelation. And slowly they lose the ability to discern the voice of God, not because he is silent, but because his voice has been drowned out by 1,000 whispers that never came from his mouth. This is why clarity is so vital. This is why we cannot afford to be silent when sacred structures are tampered with. Because when you tamper with the hierarchy of the sacred, you don't just risk doctrinal error, you risk soul damage. You risk leading people into a spirituality that feels holy, but is built on an illusion. So, if we are to protect the integrity of the soul, we must be ruthless in our alignment with truth. Even if it means pushing back against centuries of tradition, even if it means asking uncomfortable questions. Because at the end of the day, You do not stand before a tradition. You stand before a king. And he will not share his throne. Not with comfort, not with culture, not even with the mother who bore him. Let's talk about power. Real power. Not the shallow theatrical kind that parades itself around in robes, or the bureaucratic type that masquerades as spiritual authority. I mean the kind of power that governs the soul. The kind that orients the human being toward what is true and what is good and what is ultimately redemptive. Because if we misunderstand what power is, if we fail to recognize what it means to wield authority rightly, we will fall prey to its counterfeit forms. And that is precisely the danger we're facing when religious leaders, no matter how ancient their office or respected their title, begin to redefine the structure of the sacred. When the Pope or anyone in a position of spiritual influence elevates a figure, Mary in this case, to a status that subtly or overtly competes with Christ, it's not merely a theological disagreement. It's a psychological reprogramming of how human beings relate to divine authority. It teaches people, often unconsciously, to fear disobedience to human tradition more than disobedience to divine truth. And that is an inversion that leads directly into bondage. Why does that matter? Because when the psyche is conditioned to revere authority without question, especially in the realm of the sacred, it loses the very faculty that guards the soul against tyranny. Discernment. The same psychological process that causes people to obey abusive parents, corrupt governments, or narcissistic partners is now being activated in the spiritual domain. And it starts subtly, with reverence, with ritual, with tradition. It always does. But then that reverence calcifies into control, and the voice of God is gradually replaced by the echo of human voices that claim to speak on his behalf. There is something deeply dangerous in the idea that obedience to God must first pass through a human filter. That belief conditions people to associate divine favor with human approval, and over time they become incapable of hearing God apart from the institutions that claim to represent him. That's not reverence. That's codependency. And codependency in the spiritual realm is perhaps the most destructive force to the individual psyche because it masquerades as holiness. You have to ask yourself, what kind of leader demands loyalty to himself under the guise of loyalty to God? What kind of system places a human mediator between the individual and the divine when the very foundation of the Christian faith is that Christ alone is the mediator? I'll tell you what kind. The kind that confuses hierarchy with idolatry and submission with surrender to man instead of God. Let's not be naive. Psychological structures matter. The architecture of belief matters. Because those structures shape how people think, how they feel, how they live. If you teach a person from a young age that God's ear is only inclined to them when they invoke the name of Mary, or that his mercy is accessed through her maternal intercession rather than Christ's atoning sacrifice, you've not just given them an alternative pathway, you've redirected the compass of their soul. And what's worse is that people stop questioning it. They become spiritually passive. The same way a child in a dysfunctional household stops questioning the parents' inconsistencies because doing so would threaten their sense of safety. That's not maturity, that's learned helplessness. And religious institutions, when corrupted, exploit that mechanism masterfully. We know, psychologically speaking, that trauma survivors often develop what's known as a fawning response, a kind of submissive appeasement to avoid conflict. That same mechanism shows up in people's relationship with religious authority. They comply not because they are free, but because they are afraid. They say the right prayers, not because they believe, but because they've been conditioned to think that questioning the tradition is equivalent to rebellion against God. But that's not the God of Scripture. The God of Scripture invites you to reason with him, to test the spirits, to discern, to weigh truth against the word, not against a person, a pope, or even a saint. God is not fragile. He is not intimidated by scrutiny. But institutions built on control, they are. They demand silence. They demand conformity. They dress up obedience as virtue, when in fact, it is spiritual sedation. There's a deep philosophical problem here too, because when people elevate Mary or anyone else to the status of divine intercessor, they are implicitly admitting that God's mercy is not sufficient, that Christ's sacrifice is not enough, that grace must be filtered through maternal compassion because paternal justice is too frightening to face directly. That's not theology, that's projection. It's a psychological defense mechanism wrapped in liturgical language. And what does that say about our image of God? That he must be softened? That he must be appeased by a mother's plea because his own mercy is not approachable? That's not reverence. That's fear-based religion. It's rooted in a distorted view of both masculinity, and it creates generations of believers who never mature, who never stand in the full dignity of being able to approach the throne of grace boldly, because they've been taught they need a mediator to plead with the mediator. Enough. It's time we stop confusing spiritual codependency with devotion. It's time we recognize that true reverence begins not with submission to tradition, but with alignment to truth. Truth is not a title, it's not a robe, it's not a ceremony, it's a person. Christ alone. Let's talk about the cost of silence. Not just the kind of silence that avoids controversy, but the kind that lets deception masquerade as truth under the pretense of unity. There comes a point in every culture and every individual life where silence is no longer a virtue. It becomes complicity. And in the realm of the sacred, complicity with distortion is one of the most dangerous forms of betrayal because it disguises itself as humility. As if speaking out against spiritual error is somehow arrogant, as if calling deception what it is could be more offensive than letting generations walk into darkness. Now, this is not a call to cynicism, it's a call to discernment. There is a massive difference. Cynicism is rooted in bitterness and despair. It sees corruption and gives up. But discernment is an act of responsibility. It sees corruption and says, that stops here, and that's what we need, desperately, in the face of what's happening under the guise of reverence. Because when spiritual leaders begin altering the architecture of faith, when they shift the center of gravity from Christ to human intermediaries, they are not merely making a doctrinal adjustment. They are reshaping the psychological foundations of how people relate to God. And this is precisely why we cannot afford to stay silent. Because people are being taught, subtly and systematically, that their access to divine mercy is contingent on pleasing a hierarchy, that salvation is not a gift to be received, but a system to be navigated, that grace must pass through bureaucratic filters, that intimacy with God requires ritual endorsement. And all of this is dressed up in poetic language and ancient tradition, which makes it even harder for people to challenge, because who dares to question centuries of liturgy? Who dares to say, no, this isn't right? Well, you should, and not because you're rebellious, but because you're responsible. Because to see something wrong and say nothing is to participate in its spread. And that's where many believers are stuck, psychologically trapped between the desire for truth and the fear of offending authority. But if the price of loyalty is your silence, then you are not, you're a hostage. And God never called anyone to be a hostage to human power structures, especially not in his name. See, part of the tragedy here is that people confuse emotional reverence for spiritual truth. They feel something stirring in the ritual, in the candles, in the statues, in the prayers recited over and over. And they think that emotional resonance is proof of divine approval. But that's a category error. Emotional experience is not the measure of truth. We see this in abusive relationships all the time. The person still feels love, still feels nostalgia, even as they're being manipulated or controlled. Emotion does not equal truth. And spiritual systems that rely on emotional manipulation often produce deeply loyal followers, but not free ones. We are psychologically wired to associate familiarity with safety. So when the sacred becomes familiar, even if it's distorted, people hold on to it because it gives them a sense of meaning. They've never been taught to separate form from substance. They don't realize that a ritual can be ancient and still lead to idolatry. They haven't been trained to ask, what is this practice producing in my spirit? Is it drawing me into the fullness of Christ? Or is it binding me to a tradition that cannot save? And it's hard, let's be honest about that. It's hard to question the spiritual authority you grew up trusting. It's hard to look at something that has shaped your identity and say, maybe this isn't the truth. But that's the path of maturity. It's the path of every great reformer, every prophet, every voice that has stood in the gap between what is comfortable and what is right. And I don't use the word prophet lightly. I mean it in the sense of someone who speaks truth into a system that no longer wants to hear it. So if you find yourself troubled by what you're seeing, if something in you recoils when sacred titles are attributed to Mary that belong to Christ alone, or when the Pope speaks as though he has the power to redefine the spiritual order, don't ignore that voice. That discomfort is not rebellion, it's wisdom. And wisdom doesn't remain silent. It speaks not to tear down, but to preserve what is real. Because the cost of not speaking is far greater than the discomfort of confrontation. If we allow truth to be reshaped by political convenience or emotional sentiment, we hand over the future to confusion. We teach our children that tradition is more important than truth, that comfort is more important than clarity. And eventually, they'll no longer know what they believe or why they believe it. But we don't have to let that happen. We can speak, we can question, we can discern, and we must.